Okay, thank you everybody who is attending this webinar. This is the March 17th meeting of the Housing Production Advisory Council. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you, Councilmember Hill, for the celebratory attire. Just a quick announcement before I pass it over to Co-Chair Hall. The governor asked me to convey that while she isn't able to attend all of the council meetings due to her schedule, she is closely tracking the work of the council. She's getting regular briefings from the staff, and she's talking with the co-chairs. She's weighing in on the agenda and the materials. And so she will be attending as her schedule allows, but unfortunately she couldn't be here for this council meeting. So she just asked that I convey that to the full council. So with that, I will pass it over to Co-Chair Hall.
Thank you, Matt. Damian Hall here on behalf of my fellow co-chair, JD Tubby. Thank you to everyone for coming out and spending this afternoon with us doing the important work of the HPAC. I'm going to do a just quick framing up of the meeting, rundown of the agenda so everyone knows what to expect. We're starting off with a couple of presentations, one about fair housing, and then some presentations by some state agencies that have recently done housing related analyses that resulted in some recommendations that they'd like this body to consider. Then we're going to turn on the next agenda items to really some more discussion based items for the HPAC. And in that first item, we'd like to go around the horn and have council members identify some recommendations, issues, and barriers that you see in your industry and your day-to-day work and that you're familiar with. I would ask the council members to for the sake of time, keep it to one or two kind of top priorities that you see and that are in your field. There will be an opportunity to provide all of the recommendations, issues, and barriers that council members see or have been informed about by your different industries, all these different things. I have a sinking suspicion many of us have more than one or two things on our mind. But we just don't have the opportunity to discuss them all in this particular meeting. But there will be a follow-up survey. We will want to capture everybody's recommendations, issues, and barriers that you're familiar with. And then after we go around and hear from each of the council members, we have a facilitated discussion about starting to identify a framework for, once we've captured all of those recommendations, issues, and barriers, how to prioritize amongst that what we anticipate to be a pretty long list of things. And so that's the last thing on the agenda before next steps. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be pretty brisk and crisp given the number of folks that we really want to hear from that are on the line. And I want to just say a quick word to the public who's watching. Public attendees, there's not really a time for general public testimony, and the functions around the public raising your hand and speaking at this meeting are not available. That's only for council members. But members of the public can always provide written feedback and suggestions. An email has been established just for that purpose. And folks, grab your pen or pencil or whatever it is that you want. But the email is gov.hpac@oregon.gov. So that's gov.hpac@oregon.gov. All right. And then I will pass it over to, I believe, to Matt.
All right. Thank you very much, Co-Chair Hall. I'm just going to, both at the top and the bottom, make sure to ground us on where we are, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So I'm sure you all recall this flow chart from the meeting last week. We covered the first box at the top of the flow chart in laying out the overall executive order, the objectives and timelines, and putting down some shared agreements and guiding principles for the work. And then we started to talk through the actual, I guess, the structure of the plan framework. So what the sections are, which we see here. So today, again, is the second meeting. So we're going to be covering the items in orange, which is getting a chance to have our staff team highlight what existing recommendations have been produced around housing production in recent reports, and a general status update, and really a chance for any questions from the council for more context. And then the conversation, as Damien mentioned, around starting the conversation around identifying new issues, other issues and barriers to housing production that the council wants to focus on when it begins its work group process in April 1. And there'll also be a facilitated conversation to help establish how to prioritize all of the issues, because there's going to be a lot of issues. We need to know how to prioritize them. So that's where we are in the orange right now. And at the end of the meeting, I'll talk a little bit about the green and where we're going to on the third meeting. I will just, again, reemphasize that not everything needs to be captured in this meeting. The goal of this meeting is to give as much context to the council as possible for existing recommendations and answer questions, to start the brainstorm on what other issues and barriers to housing production that the council wants to focus on. We will be following up this meeting with a survey so that the council members can identify all of the existing recommendations that you each want to spend more time on beginning April 1st, as well as other issues and barriers that you want to spend time on developing recommendations around. So that survey will go out. You'll have the time and the ability to highlight all the issues you want, and that'll all come back to you at the third meeting to actually identify, okay, here are our prioritized issues by topic area so that we can move forward into the work group process. So that's where we are and where we're going. And with that, I will pass it over to Co-Chair Tubby.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see everybody again. So our first presentation is going to be from Alan Lazo from Fair Housing Council of Oregon. He'll be going through some of the recommendations as they came through. We have about 35 minutes for his presentation. So when he's done, we'll have a few minutes left, I think, to get some questions out and take some notes. So do you want to go ahead and get started, Alan? I think Matt will load your documentation.
Yeah, I think I can share my screen for my presentation. Thank you, Co-Chair Tubby and Co-Chair Hall, and Matt. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today. I, of course, recognize that there are at least three pretty significant barriers today that are drawing people's attention. I'm going to be fighting against all three of those. You know, it is St. Patrick's Day, as folks has noted, and we are in the midst of the March Madness NCAA men's basketball tournament. And up here, at least in Northwest Oregon, it is a beautiful 60-degree day. So, and we're fighting a lot of factors, but happy to be here. And I hope that this is engaging enough to hold our attention through all of those three pieces. As Co-Chair Tubby said, my name is Alan Lazo. I am the Executive Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the proud son of immigrant parents from the Philippines. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon is a private nonprofit civil rights organization whose mission is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal access to housing throughout the state of Oregon. I've also been involved in HB 2001 and 2003 over the last 3 years, including on the state's housing rulemaking committees and work groups. And I'm also a current member of the Land Conservation and Development Commission. I'm going to share my screen now just to make sure this is working properly. Does that look okay right now?
Yes.
Okay. I don't get to see it on my end, but okay, let's keep going. So I am so happy to be here. I had the opportunity last week to be present in the audience during your initial meeting that last week, and it was great to hear you all moving towards solutions in that first meeting that you had. there's I know many of you here on the council, and there's such an incredible amount of wisdom and expertise in this room that's been brought together to move us forward on these issues. This afternoon, I want us to step back a little and move our perspective out broader to this wider context of our work together in housing and community development. As Governor Kotek set the context for your work in that inaugural meeting, she noted the importance of seeing all sides so that we can be successful. For me, I know from my continuing work on all these efforts, specifically in the development of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis process over the past 3 years, and through various other related work for many years prior to that, I don't believe that we will be successful if we focus only on and measure only production of housing as we move forward. I certainly recognize that the production of housing is vital to our success and needs to happen quickly and at a much greater scale. And I'm so grateful that you are all brought together to do that because I think that's vital work. The work of housing production is no doubt part of the work that we are trying to do to implement the full and original intent of our statewide land use planning goal 10. And goal 10 also calls for us ensuring that we are meeting the needs of every person in the state of Oregon, meeting the housing needs of every person in the state of Oregon. Production is one of those 3 critical elements of our work together moving forward, particularly in that ONA process, and the part of the process in which your council is rooted. As Sean Edging from DLCD has noted in his seminal work in this area, and I think may talk a little bit more about this afternoon, our work to evolve Goal 10 is best framed in 3 elements, those elements of production, affordability, and choice. For me, in the fair housing movement and the work that we do, a vital element that's reflected here is reflected in the fair and equitable housing outcomes that really gets framed in part as housing choice. Again, from your initial council meeting, it was also really heartening for me to hear Governor Kotek emphasize the need to center racial equity and justice in your work to increase production of the needed units to meet the housing needs of every person in Oregon. The governor's executive order 23-04 also notes the commitment to affirmatively furthering fair housing, and I'll come back to those concepts at the end of this presentation. In the fair housing movement, for those that are aware, our work is deeply rooted in that specific connection between housing and community development and racial equity. In particular, the roots of the fair housing movement were set by Dr. King and his open housing movement in Chicago during the mid part of the 20th century. And as we move through these conversations together, I wanted to be sure that we also had a common understanding about some terms and concepts that I'm going to be talking about. So in this graphic here from the folks at Race Forward, or which is also in part the Government Alliance for Race and Equity, there are some concepts here that I really want to touch on around how we talk about race and racism. There are first 2 pieces that I want to talk about around institutional and individual racism. Institutional racism, as this graphic tells us, are those policies that explicitly, and then there's also 2 parallel concepts around explicit racism and implicit racism. So institutional racism are about policies that impact an entire group. And explicit racism is a form of racism that explicitly discriminates against folks. So institutional explicit in that first box is those policies that might explicitly discriminate against a full group. Implicit racism are policies that negatively impact groups unintentionally. So institutional level implicit racism are those policies that may not on their face have explicit racial intentions, but do negatively impact groups overall. Those 2 things also exist for individuals, again, at the individual level, but we're going to talk almost exclusively about the institutional level and really look at this transition from a history of explicit racist policies to what we can see become very implicit racial inequities in outcomes that we see today. And as this chart talks about, and the work that we need to do together to get further along away from those explicitly racist policies and to correct those implicit racial outcomes we need to be proactive and explicit about how we advance racial equity in our work. So in our time together, my objective isn't going to be to provide you specific directives in the work that you're doing around increasing production, but my intent this afternoon really will be to offer what I think are some cautionary tales around this work, and an ask that you all consider in your work how engaging these racial equity lenses might be reflected in the group's community agreements that you talked about last week for working together, and how that then translates into your work together as a council. I think whenever we talk about housing and housing systems, it's good to remind ourselves not only about the where we are, which is really framed in part by the charge that brought you all together as a council to increase housing production in this moment when there is so much need for housing. But there's also this need to talk about how it is that we got here today. And when we look at how we got here, it underscores that critical need for us to be mindful of and intentional about, again, those many perspectives that have been impacted by how we got here as a community. So let's talk about how we got here and how all of that is connected to where we are today as a state. This afternoon, we're going to do that by exploring these through lines that exist in examples of historical, explicit structural racism, particularly in housing policy. When we look at the racial inequities that exist today in many areas, we recognize that the history of racial exclusion in the United States that manifests itself in our housing systems is a prime example of how historical, explicit, systemic racist policies and actions now have progressed into implicit, systemic, racially inequitable outcomes. To frame this conversation, I like to use this graphic that illustrates what we can envision as these concentric waves of impact that emanate out from those historical racist policies and practices. For our purposes this afternoon, I want to focus on the enduring inequities that have resulted from these historical racist housing policies that will show at the center of this framework when we talk about it, and then we'll work outward across the impacts and outcomes of those historical policies. And then we'll talk further about some proactive efforts that we might see to correct both the explicit policies that were in the past and the implicit inequitable outcomes we're seeing today. As we do that, again, we'll clearly see how those policies transition from having explicit intended outcomes to creating enduring implicit inequities that communities continue to experience today. As we strive to center racial equity in our work, as noted by the governor during that inaugural meeting, in this framework, we'll look at a couple of examples of those enduring inequities that spawned out from that central set of historical racist housing policies, things such as exclusionary land use zoning policies or the financial disinvestment of redlining. But we also know that there are numerous other examples of historical policies that have resulted in enduring inequities, everything from a history of large public infrastructure investments that disproportionately impacted certain communities to systemic public infrastructure disinvestments in those communities that then perpetuated those inequities. This afternoon, we'll get to talk only about a handful of these direct through lines that radiate out from these central policies. I certainly would encourage you to continue exploring others that might interest you or that might be specific to your particular fields. This slide, also from the Government Alliance on Racial Equity, also highlights the connections that exist between systems and institutions and how structural racism impacts outcomes in so many interconnected areas. It highlights how housing is only one element of successful and equitable community development that we need to pay attention to. We recognize what a critical element housing is in creating access to opportunity, so we really need to make sure we don't lose sight of that critical connection in our work together to meet the housing needs of every person in Oregon. One of the things that really strikes me every time I talk about this work and have these conversations is the sheer breadth of impacts that are born from those central policies, as well as the interrelationship among the inequities in that outer ring as we talk about it, that can overlap and are all rooted in some way to these central policies. So to follow a couple of these through lines from these past policies to continuing inequities today, let's start at the center and talk about the details at each of these cascading concentric waves. So for one of these through lines that emanates from the historical racist housing policies, we'll initially examine what we often think of as the American dream, and recognize that this ideal that has been normalized as single-family homeownership in an idyllic suburb actually is rooted in a history of racial segregation. As this slide tells us here, in the early 1900s, cities across the country instituted and used zoning rules that explicitly excluded residents by race, particularly Black residents. The first to do so was Baltimore, which in 1910 adopted an ordinance prohibiting African Americans from buying homes on blocks where white residents were a majority, or vice versa. Many southern and border cities followed Baltimore and adopted similar zoning rules. Places like Atlanta, Birmingham, Dade County, in Miami area, Charleston, Dallas, Louisville, New Orleans, Oklahoma City, St. Louis, and others. In 1917, however, the Supreme Court ruled that practice to be illegal when they ended a similar racial zoning ordinance in Louisville, Kentucky, under the case Buchanan versus Worley. Not because it was a racist policy, but ruling that racial zoning ordinances interfered with the right of a property owner to sell to whomever he, she, or they pleased. This ruling, though, then gave rise to the nefarious practice nationwide of land use zoning that utilized proxies for race, namely economic status, as a means of exclusion in the form of single-family residential zoning. So when we go out to the next circle, next part of the circle here, we'll use an example from Portland. Across the country in the 1920s, there was this planning movement to create single-family residential zones that would exclude Black residents economically, because planning efforts could no longer exclude explicitly by race. And so it was during this era that land use zones were being created across the country, including right here in Portland, which had created its first land use zone, its first residential zoning map in 1924. Portland's first zoning plan included 15 single-family residence zones created by the request of property owners in those neighborhoods. This zoning plan was passed after Portlanders first rejected a zoning plan 4 years earlier, but it was Portland's real estate brokers who brought a revised zoning plan back for a vote in 1924. This after the Portland Realty Board also had adopted in 1919 in its code of ethics a provision that prohibited its members from selling real estate to Black residents and sometimes Asian residents in what were white neighborhoods. Well, I'm not here to say, I'm not sure there's evidence, or not say that there's direct evidence that Portland's single-family residential zoning or similar zoning that was implemented around the state about the same time was created intentionally to exclude by race, but it certainly was created in an environment and an atmosphere when that was the predominant thinking about land use zoning across the country. And even if the explicit intent wasn't racist and exclusionary, the impact of exclusionary zoning certainly has had that outcome in communities from an economic standpoint and by extension, a racial standpoint. Perhaps Michael Anderson, from whose Sightline article on zoning these graphics come, put it best as in his article as he notes, quote, "Does this exclusion persist because Portland homeowners sympathize with the Klan? Of course not. Here's how it works. The classist and possibly racist impulses that convinced the majority of Portland voters to start banning certain types of housing in the 1920s carved patterns of segregation into city laws and eventually into unconscious assumptions about what is and isn't normal in a city. Indeed, I bet almost all of us Cascadians now unconsciously assume it's normal for large swaths of a city to have nothing except detached homes surrounded by yards. You don't have to be a racist or classist," he says, "to live in a neighborhood shaped by racism and classism." Let's take a look at a couple of data points to highlight the points he's making here. This map from R. Anderson's article overlays those original 15 single-family residential zones in yellow with the highest income census tract groups in Portland, and you can see the continuing close relationship between those two things today. Similarly, if you overlay that original zoning plan with population by race, you can see that the historically exclusionary nature of single-family zoning, with the darker areas representing the higher percentage of white residents in Portland. So we know there's a connection between that original land use zoning and outcomes we see on the ground today. It's been interesting for me as I've done this work to watch the evolution of the narrative about eliminating single-family residential zoning as part of addressing this historically racially exclusionary zoning. This started out in Minneapolis, and of course, right here in Oregon, we had a similar conversation about single-family zoning with House Bill 2001 in 2019. While that narrative was there to address racially exclusive zoning and it accompanied House Bill 2001, as we see in these news articles here, for me, it wasn't until we saw the implementation of House Bill 2003, which was the initial pilot of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis methodology and the Housing Production Strategy Report, that we began to see the intentionality to address those specific impacts from historical policies. So when we look at that part of it, the fair and equitable housing outcome elements of the housing production strategy are what is helping to move the conversation deeper and more intentional. For example, with part of the framework around anti-displacement. So this becomes among those important next proactive steps beyond that circle toward addressing those historical inequities. There also was intentionality being put into how communities might be impacted by tools that could be implemented from this crowdsourced list of production tools and actions. Some of you may have seen it. It's kind of, it's a very long list of tools and actions that cities might adopt in moving their production as part of their housing production strategy. Another significant example of this, again, racial equity through line in the housing context was the practice of redlining that I mentioned earlier. Prior to the creation of the Federal Home Administration in 1934, buying a home meant making a down payment of 50% or more for a home and then paying off a mortgage in 5 or so years, a very difficult way to buy a home. With the insurance of the FHA, you could then buy a home with 10 or 20% down and then pay off the rest with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, the way we think of buying a home today. This was really intended to open up that American dream and opportunity for so many in this country. However, FHA loan underwriting standards incorporated racial segregation principles and racial biases. Those underwriting standards were based in part on a list from a federal appraisal manual that valued neighborhoods based on their racial makeup. This list, which was widely used from the 1920s throughout the 1940s by real estate appraisers and insurance companies, ranked lighter skinned white community members at the top, with Black residents and Mexican residents at the bottom. And the list didn't even include Native American residents as parts of communities. The use of these appraisals led to the development of color-coded maps that determined the loan underwriting risk in a neighborhood, the practice we know of as redlining. There's a website called Mapping Inequality that you can that actually captures these historical maps, and you can click on these and see the different red line, green line, yellow, and blue line zones in different communities. So one of the, again, emanating impacts of this, of redlining neighborhoods, this redlining of neighborhoods, again, as you can imagine, were communities of color that led to extreme racial inequities. It looks like sorry, let me restart PowerPoint. Okay, let's get this going again. Sorry about that. Find our place here. All right. All right. Am I back online there? Great. Thank you.
Good.
All right. So again, the redlining of neighborhoods that were predominantly communities of color led to extreme racial inequities in FHA loans. Between 1934 and 1962, Of $120 billion in loans made by the FHA, less than 2% went to non-white borrowers. Again, much of this history is highlighted in Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. In that book, he talks again about that denial of access to credit and talks about FHA's role using that explicit racial policy that solidified segregation, again, in every one of our metropolitan areas. So this isn't just a story in Portland, Oregon, and other communities here, but across the country. These FHA policies and practices were used to finance entire subdivisions in the mid part of the 20th century. Again, making those suburbs these racially exclusive white enclaves. So, it's worth noting that these efforts of the Federal Home Administration also were looked at as these historical supply side production related strategies that were intended to increase access to home ownership and wealth building, but that underlying inequitable lending practice led to the significant inequities we see on the ground today. These post-depression and then later post-World War II institutional policies, such as the GI Bill, which also had similar racialized inequitable outcomes, created wealth-generating benefits for several generations, but left out communities of color, particularly Black and Latinx communities. Economically, the resulting inequities from those racist policies today are borne out through the racial wealth gap. I'd like to use this New York Times article about a Yale study to illustrate the impact of the racial wealth gap. The study asked two questions of 100 white Americans. It asked, for every $100 earned by an average white family, how much do you think is earned by the average Black family? So that first question is about income. The second question is the one that is more interesting to me. It's for every $100 in wealth accumulated by the average white family, how much wealth does the average Black family have or have accumulated? So I'll give you just a moment to think about that. There's not going to be a quiz here, but does the average Black family have $0 to $25 of accumulated wealth to the average, to the median or average wealth of a white family? 26 to 50, 51 to 75, 76 to 100, roughly the same or more, 100 or more. There are two interesting pieces to this. I think it's, as we've talked more and more about this, it's becoming more common for us to understand that the average wealth accumulation for the average Black family is about 1/10 of it is for the average white family. That's shown here in this purple dot that is marked reality. The other thing that this Yale study found was that the white residents who answered this question, their perception of Black wealth accumulated was around $83 for every $100 of white accumulated wealth. So there's a roughly 80 or roughly a 75-point gap in reality and perception about accumulated wealth for the average Black family. The Yale researchers in this study attributed that to, in part, racial residential segregation, noting that we are so racially segregated as communities that we don't understand how other members of communities live. A report from the Prosperity Now titled Road to Zero Wealth noted that if left unaddressed, Black household wealth would be on a path to hit zero by 2053, and Forbes called it America's most pressing epidemic. Here in Oregon, one of the ways that we look at potentially addressing this is through another group in which I'm involved, the Joint Task Force on Addressing Racial Disparities in Home Ownership. What we're seeing with those, what we refer to as JARDO, is a task force that's brought forward 13 proposals that are moving through the legislature or moving towards the legislature that are intended to address the racial homeownership gap. It includes addressing areas from requiring implicit bias training for appraisers to specific lending products for communities that have long been denied access to credit markets. Again, a move outside of that circle, away from those central policies towards more proactive solutions, and an example of those proactive steps to address those racial inequities that have been built directly from that original historical through line. The other thing we should note again, that of course the inequities of systemic redlining were specifically spatially related. literally outlined on maps. This map shows the areas in Portland, particularly in North and Northeast, that were redlined here and were economically disinvested in. So as we continue to examine the expanding waves of impact of that historical denial of access to credit from the fair housing, from the FHA through the formal redlining maps, we shouldn't be surprised that there continue to be persistent inequitable outcomes today in those communities. This 2020 Salon article notes that 50 years after formal redlining ended, there's still an impact on certain neighborhoods that were redlined. We should also note that, again, here, this shows the same type of dynamic here in Portland. This graph shows the home values in Portland from 1997 to 2017 based on their homeowners loan corporation rating, where the areas that were rated the best have shown the greatest increase in values, while, unsurprisingly, for instance, the yellow stayed the lowest. It's interesting to me to note that the red line neighborhoods here, you can see that they actually crossed over and passed the yellow line in the early part of the 90s. My sense is that is actually we're seeing the impact of gentrification and involuntary displacement in those red line communities. And you can see it now moving towards the blue line and starting to catch up there. So again, that we should not be surprised that even after formal redlining was made illegal by the Fair Housing Act, those practices transitioned from the explicit nature of disinvestment by race to more implicit forms where financial redlining in the banking and lending industry still exists. We've seen examples of de facto redlining in the appraisal process of late, and certainly if we were to further explore the history of things like building code enforcement, its relationship to what would have been termed blighted neighborhoods and the urban renewal process, we would see similar outcomes today. Which brings us to today and the need for us to be bold and intentional about how we propose to move forward in community development. And for me, that certainly was captured in the governor's executive order that created this body and charged it with ensuring that it makes recommendations about meeting housing production goals, and also ensuring that, quote, housing is produced spatially in a way that is equitable and affirmatively furthers fair housing. For those of us in the fair housing movement, we see a natural relationship between affirmatively furthering fair housing and Oregon's statewide housing planning goal 10. We see that these critically needed connection between these two efforts, when you look at them side by side, the intention of goal 10 to meet the housing needs of Oregon households and AFFH's obligation to foster inclusive communities. AFFH means simply that communities cannot simply not discriminate, but they must take meaningful proactive actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. Affirmatively furthering fair housing has been a part of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and again reflects the protections in that act based on the federally protected classes of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, meaning gender, familial status, and disability. So with this concept, it brings us back full circle, as it were, to envisioning how we might do our work to remedy the impacts of this history that led to the need for civil rights protections under fair housing laws. We can envision moving along that spectrum from the historical racist housing policies through practices and norms that implicitly perpetuated those inequitable outcomes, and now moving towards, as this graph from the Government Alliance for Race and Equity illustrated, toward proactively, explicitly advancing racial equity. Just as Governor Kotek so pointedly urged all of you in your inaugural meeting and put into your charge in her executive order forming this body. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak today and to be a part of this. I am happy to answer questions, but I'm actually more happy to allow you all to discuss and react to this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. So we are 1 minute, 2 minutes over time. So if everyone, we can probably take 1 or 2 questions, and then we might just have to dip into our 10-minute break later. But I think everything's okay with that. If no one has any objections to that. I think this is incredibly important information. So if anybody has any questions, just relatively high level or kind of like where we can go with this, I'd be happy to entertain that. Anyone? Councilor Cody. Councilor Cody, will you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I just wanted to, one of the favorite examples I like to use is Levittown, Pennsylvania, from 1952 to 1958. In a single subdivision, when capital is aligned with government, over 17,000 homes were built. Completely unsustainable, racist, car-centered, exclusionary, but the power of that is an example of, I think, what we can accomplish in an inclusionary, sustainable manner.
Commissioner Rajbida.
Rajvedi, thank you. Yeah, my quick question is, we know that we haven't gone past a lot of those barriers that you talked about, Alan. Is there an actual place where maybe your body of work or somebody else has actually highlighted the current biases, implicit institutional biases that currently exist, actually highlighted that, because that would be really helpful, because we know those exist, right? And identified and highlighted. It'd be helpful for us to know that, right? In our NOFA process and many other things. So just that, yeah, that one quick comment.
Thank you, Councilor. I don't know that it is captured all in one place. I know that the work that both Oregon Housing and Community Services has done around their statewide housing plan, and the work that DLCD is doing in examining their practices are trying to gather those. But my sense is that's fairly new work, right? I mean, it's 50 years on from the Fair Housing Act, and that's work we're just getting to in some of our government institutions, frankly.
Okay, any more questions? As a personal note, I am keeping like a list of things, just things to go back and refresh on. The Color of Law, I highly suggest that anyone to read that book. It's an amazing book. It really kind of walks you through the entire, kind of history of law. And the other thing too is like even just the Fair Housing Act. And I think that's something that Damien and Matt and I have talked about, is trying to develop a little bit of a library. So what we'll probably do is try to make a short list and start sending those out, so make sure that people can start seeing some of these resources that are much more in depth. I mean, reading the Fair Housing Act, it's dry, but it's incredibly important and how much it really impacts everything. So we have dipped a little bit of time into Elena, Elise, Sam, and Mari's presentation, but do you guys want to go ahead and jump on, and we will have to cut our break just 3 or 4 minutes short. And thank you, Alan.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
All right, I'll try to get you some time back here and use my best micro machine man voice and go quickly through this. But I'm Alana Cox. I'm the Building Codes Division Administrator. It's my pleasure to be here today. Next slide, please. So what I hope to briefly do today is show you what tools the Building Codes Division has in the tool belt that impact housing production, and then some broad areas we think those tools could be better leveraged or coordinated to achieve our goals. You have our one-pager laying out our major programs in your materials, so I'll just highlight here that together with our boards, we adopt and administer the statewide code. We have a delegated statewide inspection system. We provide code support and dispute resolution. We license plumbers and electricians. We train and certify all of the building department personnel. We host an online permitting software that local government can opt into, and we have the manufactured home and prefabricated construction programs. That's my quick elevator speech on what we do at BCD, and we also have the elevator program. So next slide, please. With those tools in mind, what can we improve to address our housing shortage? My hope is that you'll see how these broad recommendations are interconnected and that they trigger some additional and more detailed ideas and areas of exploration for you all. First, how can we improve building department administration? This is about how we can get things through the process faster and how we can make the process easier to navigate and more accessible. I could talk for a couple hours on this topic alone, but I will be brief. We know some cities and counties have experimented and found ways to improve in providing timely value-added plan review and inspection services. So let's highlight and expand and scale what's working well. I heard about permit-ready plans last week on the land use side. Just wanted to note that there's an analogous tool in our tool belt to supported by the statewide code to approve master plans that can be used anywhere in the state without having to go through the full plan review process. And that tool has really been underutilized. So I think there's an opportunity to investigate why that is. And cities are getting creative with this now locally. So it's also the kind of thing we can scale from their successes. Let's leverage technology. One example I want to highlight here is an app our e-permitting team recently released. It allows for direct communication between the inspector and the customer, for video and photos to be put into the inspection record, even when there isn't cell service at a job site. This can make things more efficient in a number of ways, including avoiding travel time for some inspections. And these kinds of things I think are really going to transform the plan review and inspection processes, especially in our more rural jurisdictions where travel time is a major consideration. And then fund dedication may seem a little out of place on this list, but it is related. Not only do we want things to happen more quickly, we don't want the regulatory process to add unnecessary costs to housing development. So let's support dedication of building funds so that fees are kept low and building departments are able to have continuity of services through fluctuations in the economy. The second recommendation here is on the building department workforce. This is directly related to process improvement because most building departments would tell you they would love to turn around plans faster, but they simply cannot recruit and retain sufficient qualified staff. This is a national problem, and as Josh Leonard pointed out last week, it's both general and specific. Generally, we need more folks, but where we need them and how many depends on where we're going to see growth. And in small building departments, one vacancy can have a huge impact on services. So we need to get more qualified people, and then we need to get creative on how they are deployed. The other side of the coin here is how can we make the existing workforce more efficient? Let's make sure that everything we review on plans and inspect on a job site is necessary and serving a safety or efficiency purpose. Let's continue to expand cross-training opportunities so that a single person can do simple electrical, plumbing, and structural inspections. And let's expand the use of technology. This ties into dedicated funding as well, as it can be very hard to ramp up and recruit after layoffs in an economic downturn because of insufficient reserves. And then finally here, I listed mutual aid. Because we have a single statewide code, any plans examiner or inspector in the state is trained and qualified to do their work anywhere in Oregon. So where there's a surge activity in one place and a slowdown in another, or when one key inspector in a small jurisdiction is on medical leave, let's further leverage mutual aid agreements between the state and local government and between local governments. And then similarly, we have tools in statute that allow the state to step in and provide plan review and inspection services on specific projects. And those have generally been kind of creative commercial things in the past, but wondering if we can explore if some housing should be included, which hasn't been included in the past, to target state capacity on priority projects. Next slide, please. So this next bucket is about recognizing the growing pains we're having as we build smaller and denser. In the code, we try to strike the appropriate balance between safety, energy efficiency, and cost. We've made huge strides in safety and efficiency, but it has come at a price, both in terms of hard dollars, but also in terms of complexity, as I heard you guys discussing in your first meeting. Smaller homes inherently use less energy than larger ones. Should we explore giving them credit for that inherent efficiency to cut down on the complexity of their code requirements to encourage building more smaller units? And then while land use and building code processes are a big part of development, there are many other players, including the water purveyors, utilities, DEQ, and others. Those processes are challenging enough to navigate for a new subdivision or apartment building, but those handoffs can be even more challenging in the context of adding density to existing infrastructure. And that includes the adaptive reuse of buildings, including, for example, turning office space into housing units, which has been a topic of interest lately. So let's take a global look at these processes and handoffs, not just for traditional new construction, but for these more complex projects that will need to be part of our all hands on deck approach to meeting our housing production needs. And then in the vein of coordination, let's get a handle on every funding opportunity that can help with housing production, and let's make sure we're aligned as agencies, and also that there's robust outreach so that these opportunities are available broadly and Oregonians can maximize their share of these federal dollars. Finally, let's get more skilled electricians and plumbers in Oregon, and let's make sure we're maximizing their time using their craft. Again, ties into the conversation you were having about how much time folks are spending on process requirements versus doing the traditional electrical and plumbing work. I think you'll be hearing more from my colleague at HPAC later in this presentation on detailed recommendations in this area. So I could go on and on, but that concludes the broad recommendations from the Building Codes Division. I'm happy to answer any questions or take flags for follow-up, recognizing we have limited time today. And I look forward to supporting you further as you progress in your work.
Thank you, Elena. We'll go to committee member Flagan, sorry.
Elena, thank you. Just a quick question regarding the code. Is there an opportunity to do a special middle housing code to encourage affordability for small homes and also encourage small units, multifamily units to be built, so we don't have to have going from 2 units to 3 units, that you have to go from residential to commercial?
Thank you for the question, and those have definitely been hot topics. I think when House Bill 2001 passed, we did make a special path for middle housing in terms of conversion of single family into 2, 3, 4 plexes. But I think there's additional work to do in that space, absolutely. And our Residential and Manufactured Structures Board asked us to explore whether we can scale some of particularly our energy efficiency requirements based on the size of the home, which is an approach they take in some other states, including Washington. I think what we'd like to do is make sure we're doing that in a thoughtful way that's data-driven, so that we're not accidentally making it so that everybody is building 1,999 square foot houses, and that it makes sense and that it's not adding complexity. And I think that's the challenge. I think we're proud in Oregon of our relatively simple menu system for efficiency in the building code. And I don't think anyone's talking about waiving safety requirements. So you would be talking about simplifying, I think, energy efficiency requirements. So it's work we're working on, but I think we could use some further development in that space. And that's why it was on the list here. I think there is room for opportunity in all of the things you mentioned.
Committee member Hill. You're on mute, Mr. Hill.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you for your presentation. And a couple of things come to mind with your presentation is, one, you talk about efficiency. So every dwelling unit or every apartment has to have a water and sewer line. We don't, now the code will not allow the excavation contractor to run the water line and sewer line in at the same time he digs. He has to leave. Then he has to let somebody, the water and plumber, or the plumber, come back at his leisure and run those back in, then return again. Same guys are running the water and sewer lines in the street to a much tighter tolerance than these will be running on site. Why can't we get the code changed to allow either the general contractor or the excavation contractor to run that water and sewer line? It adds $500 to $1,000 per house to that inefficiency. The next thing is executive orders on code changes, particularly on insulation. Those throw us a kind of a monkey wrench in things, because you don't ever know what to expect, and it never reaches us down here, especially in rural Oregon, on what those executive orders have been. Third thing is, you talk about more plumbers and electricians. Well, tell me how we're going to get more plumbers and electricians. BOLI isn't at the table here, and everything has to pass through BOLI. And I brought this up before, and I'm going to keep harping on it. It's because of the apprenticeship ratio to journeyman. 1-to-1 for electricians, 1-to-1 for plumbers. Where I live, Idaho, 4-to-1 for electricians, 1 to unlimited for plumbers. We can get a supply, but we can't get a supply over here because we can't train them. In fact, the 23rd, I have a meeting with BOLI at the high school level, trying to get it started there so that we can get some in the pipeline. We have an aging workforce. So we have an aging workforce of journeymen. They're quitting. And so how are we going to get these plumbers and electricians trained? Because you're not going to build 80% more houses unless we break that bottleneck of plumbers and electricians at the bully level. So thank you. That's all I have to say. And perhaps you can help.
Sure, I'll do my best on a few of those. So I think that first code issue you mentioned is actually a licensing issue. And I have heard that it's been particularly challenging in your part of the state. I think it would require a statutory change, and I'm happy to talk to you more offline about it. The EOs and our last governor did issue 2 executive orders on energy efficiency in the built environment, EO 1720 and EO 2004. And they do have a lot of requirements. Now, the good news is they are all to be evaluated in terms of whether those requirements would pay off in the long term, right? I think the challenge is that paying off in the long term doesn't necessarily address your ability to get into housing, right? So if you're not going to own that new construction house for 50 years, and you can't get to it because of the cost of that house. So it's something we wrestle with all the time. What's the appropriate balance to strike on energy efficiency? And then in terms of plumbers and electricians, I think you're right. We don't have authority over the apprenticeship side of that coin, but our electrical and elevator board and state plumbing board have been making strides to make it easier for folks to come in from out of state with their craft. And, we were able to execute a reciprocity agreement with the state of Washington on the electrical side, and the plumbing board issued new rules to acknowledge a double the hours pathway that creates a pathway to licensure in Oregon for a lot of folks that didn't have a pathway before. So I think we've got to attack it from all sides, but being thoughtful that it's all connected. And
why do we want them to come in from out of state? Why don't we want to train them in our own state? Right here where I live, I can count on one hand the electricians and plumbers of color. I can count on one hand. Yet I have at the school level, at the high school level, many of them that want to get in that trade, but you can't get them in because you can't get a sponsorship. It's discriminatory, and I don't like it. And I want to get our kids trained to do something so they have a future.
No, it's a fair point. I think we need both. I think one of the challenges that all licensing entities are struggling with is we just have a more mobile workforce than we used to. So if we're stopping qualified electricians and plumbers at the border and they don't want to move to Oregon because of our requirements, I think that's holding us back. But we need to do both for sure.
Thank you for the question, and we'll go to Committee Member Bunn.
Thank you, Director, for your presentation. I like all your recommendations. That's great work for us to start with. I have a question. How does Building Code Division take input and feedback from the design professionals, contractors that actually have to work through your code? And I bring that up because of an example that I came across this week. There's an amendment to SB 847 related to loading of single loading stairwells for mid-size stuff. Okay, you can speak about the technical stuff to that. The theory is you can get more efficient housing in that mid-range and not compromise on safety. Other places have done it, but it's not standard under IBC. Well, I understand that that's a thing to discuss, but there's significant push for that from the design professionals. They're going up to the legislature to pass a law to force your division to do an OAR. I mean, it feels like that should all be something that's happening as part of the regulatory process, not going through the legislature. And I say that with lots of respect, having been a local elected official. Electeds aren't necessarily the best people to be making those kinds of technical decisions, but there's some frustration from the design professional community saying the way we administer our building code there's no process to go through and look at. Just because it's in the IBC, maybe we can make some changes and adopt them. So do you have a process for that? If not, or why is it not working better than it is, I guess? I mean, that might just be an education question for me.
It's a great question. We do have a robust code adoption process, and it includes a 45-day solicitation of public proposals. So basically, we partner with our boards in code adoption, and our boards contain positions that represent a lot of different folks, including the design community. So they have a position on the Building Code Structures Board and the Residential Manufactured Structures Board. And then we solicit ideas, right? So they decide what the base code will be, the model code. You're talking about the IBC, the International Building Code. And then we go through Oregon amendments and then every proposal that comes in the door. And I won't comment on any existing legislation, but I will say we've never gotten that proposal to go to a single stairwell. And so I think it's telling me we need to do a better job making folks aware of how to engage in the public proposal process and how to bring us ideas. You know, we identify those as a division, but I think we could do a better job casting a broader net for good ideas on how we can change the building code. We do it on a 3-year cycle, so we're always about to adopt a building code. So the opportunity is always around the corner.
Thank you, Director. And maybe as a second on question on that is what is your relationship with like the professions, like the electricians, the inspectors, and how often do you meet and how often are you like engaging in some of these new and inventive kind of codes as they are developed, because I know even like for inspectors and electricians, they start talking about codes years in advance. And I don't know how involved you guys are with that development early on.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we try to engage at the national model level as well with those, with the trades and with others to keep track of what's coming down the pike in the model codes. And we have a state plumbing board, an electrical and elevator board. We partner with those boards. They have control over licensing. And then on any code adoption, it requires board approval and division approval. So there's a great partnership there. And then the Oregon Building Officials Association is also an excellent partner. We meet with them all the time, talk about good ideas. They brought us an idea on how they identified a gap in how you can become a residential inspector with out-of-state experience. They brought it to us and we're working on writing new rules right now to address that gap. So we have ongoing conversations with all those stakeholders, but also recognize we can always do a better job hearing from more folks and making sure folks are aware of our programs and where there are opportunities.
Great, thank you. And one more comment too. This is a conversation that came up with the governor earlier this week, and I think all of us are at about that generation where a lot of the trades, being a mechanic and those things, were kind of I don't know how else to describe it, but demobilized. Like you had to go to college, you need to become work in an office, you have to do all these other things, and that to be a mechanic or to be a tradesman or something like that was like less than something. And it was one of those suggestions, like how do we re-ennoble those the trades, people working in the trades and STEM, and it's noble to be a mechanic, it's noble to be a carpenter, it's noble to be an electrician. I know an electrician will make more than I do, and I got student loans, so so it's probably much better. All righty. So any other questions do we have? Anyone like to ask the director? And we do have about 10 minutes, and so thank you for Director Cox for running through that. Go ahead, Committee Member Cody.
Thanks. Is it true that the Building Codes Division appropriates or allocates jurisdiction to the individual localities, so counties and cities? So if a city doesn't have a building department, they can defer to the county. If the county doesn't, sometimes they defer to the state. So if a city or county weren't meeting its housing production goals, could you take away that authority?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we do have a delegated state inspection system, and you did a great job describing it. So if a city doesn't have one, it goes to the county. If the county doesn't have one, it goes to us. Our building official always says we're the building official of last resort. We've got 8 counties in Central Oregon. So that is how it works. And there are metrics they have to follow in order to maintain that program assumption. They've got to renew it. And they've got to follow certain rules. Housing, like how much housing is happening in those communities, is not one of those rules. But we also certify all of the individual professional building officials, plans examiners, and inspectors. So it means that, for example, if there's local political pressure to say, well, I don't care what the code says, just do this, not only does that get them in trouble for their inspection program, that gets them in professional trouble with us. So we do have tools absolutely for local government oversight, but we really are their partners, because not only do we partner with the Building Officials Association, we are a building official. So we get to see it kind of from a firsthand perspective of what the challenges are.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? We still have about 5 minutes, so you did get us right back on track. Thank you. So actually, I mean, if anyone has any questions for any of our speakers, Mr. Laszlo or Director Cox, I'd be happy to entertain those now that we have a little bit more time in our schedule.
Co-Chair Tuvey, just as a flag, we have a couple more presenters to get through for this agenda.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, sorry, I thought it was Director Cox only. So we'll jump on to the next one then. So do we have Elise and?
Good afternoon, HPAC members. My name is Mari Valencia Aguilar. I am a housing planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I will probably skip a couple of my slides just to kind of let the other two colleagues who are also presenting, representing state agencies, and to have time here too. But quickly, last week you heard from my colleague Sean Edging, who provided a very high-level overview of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. You might recall this is a body of work that my agency, in partnership with OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, has been working on for the last few years. Alan, in his presentation, noted a lot of the work that came out of that. And in fact, a set of recommendations came out of that body of work and are currently under consideration in the legislative session right now under House Bill 2001. My presentation, though, however, focuses on a set of policy issues that were raised by ONA stakeholders that did not fall under our, that we received that either didn't fall under our agency's authority or the project scope of work. But nonetheless, were very important and critical items to support housing production, affordability, and choice. These recommendations that we're putting forward are outlined in Appendix B of the ONA report that was part of your meeting material packet. So if I could go to the next slide. Quickly, I just want to note here that, and my colleague Sean kind of touched on this in his presentation, we engaged, or we had a very robust public involvement process that was part of the ONA project. It was over a year long, and there was multiple components. These are the three themes that kind of emerged from the conversations. And I just wanted to remind, or I flag this here as a reminder that while a lot of the recommendations informing the ONA really were informed by the feedback that we received. And the components included anywhere from focus groups to a working group. We did regional forums, and we did follow-up engagement sessions. But ultimately, these are the three that emerged: partnership between state and local governments, accountability from all levels to ensure that we're working towards housing needs, to meeting housing needs, and then investment to support housing production, and especially focus on affordable housing, which the private housing market cannot produce on its own. If we can go to the next slide, please. On this slide are recommendations from the ONA that are currently not under House Bill 2001. So they're not under consideration in the legislative session right now under that bill. There are other bills that touch on some of these, but I think it's worthy of reminding here and just flagging as a possibility for this group to just consider as part of the work that you are all charged with. Recommendation 2.1 focuses on funding. As we know, to meet our annual housing production target, it's going to require commitment to sustained and coordinated investment. And so a close attention to funding, either coordinating funding across state agencies and at all levels is something that is important. And then, of course, funding to support affordable housing to meet the critical needs of our Oregon's lowest income households. Recommendation 3.1 is about state and local agencies committing to working together with urgency on housing production. We heard from stakeholders who raised a significant need for greater partnership and coordination among all levels of government, and to have a unified approach towards achieving greater housing production, affordability, and choice. Functionally, recommendation 3.1 is a recommendation to establish an administrative mechanism who would be charged to work towards equitable housing production and coordinate and partner with state agencies and local governments on policies and investments that support production. This administrative mechanism would be charged with the development of a housing production strategy, similar to the one that local governments with a population of 10,000 are currently required to produce as part of their obligation under Goal 10, statewide planning Goal 10 housing. And so that recommendation is along the same lines there. Now 3.2, if we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. This recommendation really is kind of where Appendix B recommendations come into the conversation. In the stakeholder feedback, a lot of the stakeholders raised this policy issues outside of our agency's scope and authority. And I mentioned before, but they're very relevant to the housing production conversation that you all are charged with. We know this at the state level, and stakeholders also noted that there's a lot of agencies who are in the housing space, and but we're not very good sometimes at partnering and coordinating. And so as a consequence of this dynamic of us kind of working in our silos, a lot of recommendations came about that didn't really fall under our agency's authority. But we did feel like they were excellent recommendations, excellent issues that need policy refinement and further consideration. And so we outlined those in Appendix B, thinking it could be a really good basis for this administrative mechanism that I just mentioned under recommendation 3.1 that could use as a starting point for the work with that work ahead. So in Appendix B, we've organized the recommendations under 5 categories. Those are the ones that you see here on your screen. There are 8 recommendations included that speak to the issue of housing some of the barriers associated with housing production and affordability. As an example, you'll find a recommendation that seeks to kind of do a deeper dive on SDCs and infrastructure planning to further refine some of the barriers that exist there. And the recommendation there was to utilize a recent publication by OHCS on an SDC study as a way to kind of get that conversation, get that policy refinement underway. Like I said, there's 8 recommendations, so there's more there. The second bucket includes 4 recommendations that get at increasing homeownership and housing stability. We heard a lot about, in Alan's presentation, the wealth gap and homeownership gap among people of color and white counterparts. And so those recommendations there kind of are there to support some of that work that's needed. As an example, a recommendation included there is the need to study and do more focus on different types of ownership models, like a limited equity housing co-op that is focused and targeted at the lower income households. The third bucket here, there are 3 recommendations that support increasing accessibility and housing choice for people with disabilities. We had a lot of feedback about an urgent need for state and local government agencies to better plan for different types for housing types and accessibility features suitable for people living with all of the different types of disabilities. And we know that our housing stock does not currently meet the demand for accessible housing, and so more attention is needed there. The fourth category came out of a discussion that we had with tribal members. They were one of the local government forums that we held. And while tribes are sovereign governments, they're not subject to our statewide planning goal 10 requirements. We did engage the tribes because that is a value that we hold at our agency. We're committed to working in partnership with the tribes, and it's important to support, equitable housing production issues that they also face. And so there's 4 recommendations there that they outline as further attention needed. And the last the last bucket here are it gets at kind of what Alan's presentation was talking about. There's 6 recommendations that would further advance affirmatively furthering fair housing. And, this is really getting at this need for strengthening tools, developing policies that better support and ensure that folks, especially protected classes, have equal access to opportunity and choice. So I encourage you all to take a look at that Appendix B and really dive deep into all of the extensive recommendations. And by no means is it an exhaustive list, but it is what we heard from the ONA stakeholder group, and it could be a really good resource or a starting base for the conversations here. And I think that was my last slide. Oh.
Great, thank you so much. And I apologize to everybody. I misread the agenda and thought those were unified. So we're about 5 minutes over time and still have 2 more presentations to go. So I'm gonna kind of do chair's prerogative and say we're going to try to rush through these next 2 presentations. I don't want to short shrift them whatsoever. But if you guys have any questions, please make note of them. And like I said, we're trying to figure out a best way to create like a library of information. I think most of these presentations are going to be made available. And we will figure out a way to do like a group chat, group email, so that we can have a conversation going on continuously outside of even these meetings. So if you don't mind, I'm going to jump ahead to Mr. Thomas. Or Elise, sorry. Elise and Natasha? Yeah, there you go. Natasha. There you go, sorry.
No worries. Hi, this is Natasha Detweiler-Davy from Oregon Housing Community Services. Nice to be here today, and I will do my fast track version of this. So let's see, let's go to the next slide. And I think the intent of, goal for this additional presentation, we included in your materials a series of documents that we've published over the past 6 months to a year, kind of tracking different issues. So I wanted to do first a little bit of a very quick overview of OHCS, Oregon Housing and Community Services, and then give a little bit more context to the information in your packet. So we are, a housing community services agency. What you see on the screen here are our 5 strategic goals and priorities from our statewide housing plan. So covering kind of the full spectrum of work. I can go to the next slide. We have, as an agency, been growing very tremendously over the past decade. And so you can see the resource growth at the agency. Next slide. And this is specifically to our work prioritizing the development of our, or the growth of our affordable rental housing pipeline up to 25,000 over the course of 5 years. And so this is a goal that we are well on target for accomplishing, with just under 25,000 in the queue right now. And I think is also an emphasis and a point where, you know, the accomplishing the 5-year goals within a much shorter timeline is currently where we are striving to get to within the current executive order. Next slide. And this is just an overview of the housing supply across the state, and the OHCS portfolio is approximately 8% of the statewide total housing stock. And I included in the materials that we sent a link to our housing dashboard, which has just recently been updated, so you can really dig in and see more details of all of the work. Next slide. And so, you know, from the Affordable Rental Housing Division, we really operate as the state's housing finance agency. And so we see ourselves as absolutely a funder of affordable rental housing. We want to expedite production. We need to ensure that we are culturally responsive. We are also wanting to make sure that we are developing assets of quality that will continue to be community assets into the long term and can serve as a catalyst for community economic growth and overall well-being. We look to all of these in alignment to achieving more than just a roof. In a lot of cases, seeing ways that we, you know, was really, as Alan's first presentation really touched on, the real interconnectedness that housing plays with all of the other systems of education, climate, racial justice, and economic growth and activities. And so it's really with that lens where, when we are moving through with the funding process, we are also embedding these policy objectives into the offerings. Next slide. One of the memos in your packet included the same graphic, so no worries, I won't read through each step here. But to highlight, a development process for housing is not a quick switch. And yet there are ways that we can include and establish pivots in the way that OHCS and the state interacts with developers to be able to provide resources. Right now, our structure is competitive through a NOFA process that I know folks have referenced, a notice of funding availability. We put funding into projects early before there's a lot of the final due diligence items that are accomplished, including things like final architectural drawings, market studies, and on down the list. So those are things that at this moment in time, we provide a reservation for resources to a project, and then projects spend somewhere around a year, sometimes more, sometimes a little less, working through those other due diligence items before they are ready to really break ground and enter into construction. We also have our system designed with customized offerings. So we do those NOFAs, and we have specific policy intent and drivers behind each of those NOFAs. So there's specific resource offerings for permanent supportive housing, for net new units, for rehab, for small projects, for veterans, and on down the list. And as we talked about in our those materials, we are also, I guess next slide, putting out now upwards of 15 different resources to projects. And so this has also been a continued evolution of OHCS and our work in funding. What used to be just a couple different flavors of resources has really expanded more broadly. Do the next slide. So that we now have, again, upwards of 15 different resources that are putting in there. And so the structure of putting them into NOFAs that are policy driven and aligned has created a lot of different navigation barriers for making that really easy to understand and access. At the same time, we know that we want to drive to policy intent, have the bigger objective. Next slide. Okay, so now I just want to kind of regroup around the things that we are seeing, and this is covered in some of the materials. We have a real and sincere constraint in the private activity bond space. We, over the course of the last several years, largely generated with the onset of the state investing Article 11Q bonds, added into that then the Metro bond that was passed. We have really expanded a focus on leveraging the 4% tax credit with state gap funding. The mechanics of that is that in order to generate a 4% credit, you need to finance at least half your project with private activity bond authority. That private activity bond authority is allocated by the federal government to each state. So where we used to operate in a world where we had savings from not using it fully year to year, we have now gone through all of that savings and are fully spending down the amount of private activity bonds that is allocated to the state of Oregon annually. So we have, over the past year and a half, really worked to pivot our program in the 4% tax credit arena to focus on readiness to proceed, being able to move faster. But this also means that as we expand gap resources, we have a barrier for being able to continue to leverage that into every project. At the same time, we are seeing and experiencing ongoing and increasing volatile costs. One of the submissions that we had was around our market cost offset fund effort to provide additional last-minute gap funding to projects as they were reaching the closing table to be able to begin construction. And remedy that dynamic. And so thanks to state investment, we were able to get quite a lot accomplished through that. But it really just goes to speak to the increased volatility that we are seeing. We are also finding that we are having an increased demand and interest from communities to get technical assistance and guidance in putting together funding strategies. And we are engaged in efforts to support advancing racial equity goals. We have established MWSB requirements and have stood up an internal external work group to help advise and engage in strategies around growing that supply of workforce across the state. Next slide. And while we are constrained in private activity bonds, OHCS is doing what we can to try to expand the funding tools to further be able to drive to development, including finding other means for doing lower interest rate or tax exempt loans. That is part of the benefit of a private activity bond authority, is that it is it's a tax exempt and so therefore lower interest loans. We have done some pilots on recycling private activity bonds. Neither of these are things that would necessarily create additional leverage, generate that 4% tax credit, but they are means for providing additional resources to projects. Also looking to creative uses of our existing resources like our Oregon Affordable Housing Tax Credits, and understanding, that many states have state low-income housing tax credit programs as well. Next slide. So part of the, kind of rolling up to the recommendations that we put forward, part of our, our effort in trying to make sure that we can be prioritizing expediency and delivery of resources to community, are looking toward finding different ways to reframe our funding strategies instead of perhaps funding so early, maybe funding closer to readiness when we have really secured and understand what the project costs will be, align resources to those projects that are shovel ready, and then step away from a process, looking to find whether we can step away from a process of real robust competition and instead set a reasonable floor for performance, and then know if there are resources to align to that, that there would be more certainty to move forward. At the same time, that pivot really would require that we work to foster and support a development pipeline, being able to provide technical assistance and guidance to community, be able to put resources to support all of the real costs that come with pre-development activities, and then also invest in expanding capacity broadly, and in particular with BIPOC development partners. We also are well aware of different internal and external barriers to moving quickly. And I think a lot of the different strategies being put forward to this council are tackling, the different systems, but specific to our resource, looking at our legal documentation process, our fund offering around consolidating. Can we make our resources more easy to navigate from an external perspective? And then what resources would we need to bridge the availability of resources generated perhaps through bond issuance and others? So I hope that was not too fast to not be helpful at all, but that's where I will wrap up today and look forward to any follow-up.
Great, thank you again. And once again, sorry we have to cut a little bit short, but if anybody has any questions, be sure to keep them all written down. And Matt and I were talking in the background. And for the time being, go ahead and send them directly to Matt. I believe all you have his email questions, and he'll be collating those. And then we're also going to be discussing ways like a clearinghouse for questions like an FAQ, so we can engage that way as well. So again, we're going to jump to Mr. Thomas and talk about the Oregon Talent Assessment.
Thank you all. My name is Sam Thomas. I'm a workforce program analyst with the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, and today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Oregon Talent Assessment. Next slide, please. So the summary for the OTA, you guys have probably seen this and read some of it, but it provides insights into several key employment sectors. Construction is identified as one of those kind of broadly, and within that, there's some interesting employers' perspective on the state of the Oregon's workforce. Specifically, in the appendix, there's a section on construction firms' responses to some survey questions and some interviewee questions that are really insightful for some of the recommendations. The ones I want to touch on just today briefly is the list of recommendations that were in that talent assessment in Figure 6. If you could go to the next slide, please. The primary objective, as I see it for the HPAC, is to look in this specific document to look at these recommended reforms in Figure 6 and see which ones they want to advance. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read through all of these. Obviously, we got it short on time, but they're kind of divided by federal, state, and then educational institutions, abilities to kind of affect some of these changes. So they're kind of grouped up by actor. And these are some of the recommendations. They've been pared down a little bit in the staff recommendations, but if there are specific ones in like under the state's purview that you guys think may be really important to include to take a deeper dive into, definitely interested in hearing more from you guys on that. Next slide, please. And this is just the rest of the list of the summary. So there's also some items in there for like employers to focus on too. And I know an emerging theme is around getting youth interested in apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeship programs, registered apprenticeships. So definitely see that as a work group that will kind of allow some more coordination with other agencies, specifically BOLI, that are in charge of registered apprenticeships that would be able to provide staff support and insight on some of their programs. And that's all I have for you guys. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was a lot of information, and we'll be taking notes, I'm sure, and hopefully collating some notes. We do have a scheduled break. We are about quite a bit over time, but I do think we need to probably go do a quick stretch and go walk around a bit. So let's go ahead and probably take, I'm taking some cues from Damien and Matt about taking about a 5-minute break till 3:11, and then we'll come back and we will try to race through. During that time, make sure you are thinking about things that have not been discussed. Like we discussed earlier, we're looking for new ideas or new issues that have not been addressed so far. We'll go around quickly through the room, and then hopefully we'll have some time to discuss those and explore those as time allows. So we'll see you again at 3:11. Thank you. I think I talked a little bit into that first minute, so we'll give people a couple, 30 seconds more as people come back. Damien, do you want to go ahead and kind of walk us into the next one, and we'll start facilitating that as people come back?
Gladly, thank you. So thanks to the folks from the different departments of the state that gave us those presentations, reminding the members of the council that you have a high-level summary of each of the recommendations coming out of all of that work that's been done by the state to date. And you'll have an opportunity in a survey that follows, that you receive following this meeting to, comment on each one of those recommendations that are existing. So now that we've gotten, the summary of what the state is thinking about as far as issues, barriers and recommendations, now we want to hear, at least begin to hear what the council is thinking about as far as recommendations, issues, and barriers. So for the sake of time, we'd like everyone to provide one or two of the primary things that you have come across in your day-to-day that are issues or barriers for housing production. And everyone on the council is encouraged to participate in this. It's it's Zoom and we're tight on time, so it's not going to be the perfect discussion, and we're not going to get everything on the table, but we will be facilitating more opportunities to provide numbers 3 through however many on your list, and all of those things following the decision. So I think with that, we should probably just go with whomever would like to raise their hand and go first and tell us the top 1 or 2 things that are on your mind as far as things around the state. All right, fantastic. We've got participation. So I'm going to go and do this very unscientifically and just go in the order that boxes show up on my screen. So I apologize if for those who happen to be on the second screen, etc. But starting with Karen Rockwell, you go ahead.
I really want to reiterate the need for increased capacity and support the idea of the technical assistance in all of the spaces. Just going to keep it brief because I know it's not new, but I just want to reiterate that that's huge, especially for the coastal rural areas.
All right, thank you, Karen. Margaret Van Vliet.
Thank you. My major idea I want to put on the table is that we need more innovation generally. And I think there's room for us to be more proactive with offsite construction methodologies and prefab kinds of things. There are other states and other countries that are way ahead of us and able to produce housing at scale that's very high quality, energy efficient, and we need to get on that bandwagon. So my other one is more sort of ties on to what the last speaker just mentioned about technical assistance and capacity building. It's like we need sort of SWAT teams almost on the ground to help with all the various parts of how it is municipalities and developers and community groups can engage in scaling up production in their communities. So those are my 2.
Thank you, Margaret. Alyssa Gertler. Oh,
Damien,
yeah.
One question. Margaret, on that's an excellent idea. And you mentioned the manufacturing in the other countries. Something to also think about is if you have case studies of anything of this stuff going on, and forward that on to Matt, and then as a concept too. I think that'd be really.
Well, I already did. I'm 1 step ahead of you, Co-Chair Tovey. So thank you.
Fantastic. Appreciate that. And then Alyssa, go right ahead.
Thank you. I am really struck by the importance of the integration here. And I really kind of want to elevate that as a discipline in itself. I think about where I'm working in a small coastal community where we need pre-development, we need capacity building. It's in a wetland with a landslide, so we need the building code. We need a whole new way to engage parts of the community that haven't participated. We have, you know, pretty much every presentation, we don't have a workforce, and so we need to figure out how to integrate that. And so I feel like it's not a new thing, but elevating how we pull these pieces together is actually key to it, right? Each of what you all said, I agree with, but as it comes to work on the ground, there's got to be a way to sort of team captain it and have a critical path and make sure that what I'm doing on the tax credit side works with the building code and the local government side, and it's just so important. And so I just want to highlight that that's a key focus for me.
Absolutely. Appreciate it, Alyssa. And just so that you know, we're coordinating everything that's getting said is being documented by Matthew and his team, and we'll get that all incorporated into a list, and then opportunity for everyone to add to those lists as well. But yeah, the coordinating piece, the information piece, how do we know, you know, years down the line if we're doing well or not well, why, all of these different things following out of this process are really critical. Next up, Daniel Bunn, go right ahead.
My takeaway thus far, you're talking to people who work in the development community, government, and listening here, is that we have lots of really great policy priorities and no way to evaluate them when they're in competition. We could talk all day about things that we support: DEI, climate change, MWSEB, environmental protection, transit issues, transportation, growth, equity. We load the pony so much, especially on the affordable housing side, that things just slow down and die of their own weight. And we've done that so much that we're now in a crisis where we're clearly not producing enough housing. We started off our meeting today with a presentation about how government regulation had some horrible, horrible consequences. And so I think we need to be very careful looking to just knee-jerk throwing more regulations as a solution. We need to be very intentional about what we do and what the actual effect is. So as far as actionable items, I think number one, we need to look at our land use system and the fact that despite all of its good intentions, it functionally right now preserves the status quo. And an institution preserving the status quo, in my opinion, is at odds with some of our big public policy goals and remedying things that have gone wrong in the past. With the way land use is, everyone has to agree. Anyone can raise their hand and file an appeal for low cost and stop a project. And this is after local electeds have signed off. We're in a representative democracy. We say, we've decided this is good for the community. The state signed off. LCDC says, yeah, that's good. And anybody can bring a process to a screeching halt. And it's killing our ability to deliver stuff. So I'll stop there.
All right. As a land use attorney, I'm familiar with that process and I hear what you're saying. Joel Madsen, go right ahead, sir.
Thank you, Co-Chair Hall. If I may, just a +1 to all my fellow council members that have talked about capacity, particularly as it relates to affordable housing developers' capacity to be able to carry out the development process. We have local affordable housing developers in every corner of the state, and we'll be here well into the future. We need to lift them up. We need to supercharge our existing industry to help address our housing needs going forward. But I hope that +1 is not one of my 2 recommendations. I just wanted to emphasize that. So my 2 recommendations, one is we've charged our cities over $10,000 to produce housing production strategies. It's not clear to me that the recommendations from our state agencies have really accepted those recommendations from local communities. And I would like us to see that we're incorporating those recommendations that we're seeing and hearing from people on the ground in every jurisdiction around the state that submitted those production strategies, that we're lifting those up in the process and making sure we're not missing good ideas from our local community partners. My second recommendation is that we look within ourselves and the ownership of land within our urban growth boundaries. Who owns the land, right? Our largest landowners are probably public ownership. And we need to have a clear inventory, not just of the surplus lands, but what lands are in our urban growth boundaries that are held in public ownership. And how do we nudge forward in transitioning the uses where it makes sense to do so, to have it be the highest and best use to address our housing challenges. And that's loaded with a lot of complexity. I understand that. But I'd really like us to focus on, again, the existing land availability within our urban growth boundaries, particularly as it relates to publicly owned lands.
Right on. Thank you, Joel. Ivory, you can go right ahead.
Thank you, Coach Hall. Joel just took my statements directly from me, but I will just add that I like to see how we engage land banks and those public authorities or nonprofits who were created specifically to acquire, hold, and manage properties that we can have access to redevelop and return. Goes back to used to be like community use. So how we engage with institutes. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ivory. And I'm not sure if it was just mine, but I got most of that. A little bit of it was kind of tinny, but on your audio. Moving to next is Justin Wood. Justin, go ahead, sir.
Real quick, Ivory, do you mind writing that down and sending it? I think a lot of people missed that. That was a little bit garbled, quite a bit garbled in your microphone. Do you mind writing that and sending that to us?
Yes, I'll definitely send it to you.
Yeah, you can just say it. Sound loud and clear. Yeah.
Awesome. I just changed my
now you're good.
my standards, my settings. So what I said was I agree with what Joel said, and I wanted to add that I'd like for us to really consider how we're engaging land banks and public authorities or nonprofits who were created to acquire, hold, and manage properties for redevelopment, particularly of all different types of housing affordability, and see how we can partner with those entities in development of our strategies. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you. Appreciate it. Justin Wood, please.
Okay, so I think everybody's had some great things to say, but I think a lot of what everybody's looking at tends to be the bigger picture stuff. Just on the ground building, and primarily in Portland, a lot of the fundamental problems are just getting our permits through the system that we currently have. We could do all these things. If we can't figure out a way to get permits through our system faster and better, that's a huge problem. I mean, we're not building projects in the city of Portland right now just because we can't get them permitted. So one is really taking a look at the permit regulatory systems and where we can streamline some of those processes, because there's some things I'm totally getting planning standards and life safety stuff and all that important stuff. But some of the stuff that we get bogged down in the minutia of just the most little details at cities that really don't have an impact on anything, like locations of water meters, 1 foot one way or the other. We've gone round and round on that, just trying to, in the grand scheme of things, really is not mattering. So that is a big one for me, is figuring out permitting streamlining. The second real big one is, and I think a lot of people, including some of the nonprofits I worked with up here in Portland, deal with as well, is public works. We've got planning codes that we all follow. We have building codes that we all follow. When it comes to public works, a lot of that's just free game. They, a lot of the bureaus can write their own rules when it comes to their transportation standards. They can write their own rules when it comes to their sewer and water standards. They don't have to provide any notice as to when they change their systems. They can do whatever they want. We honestly looked at a parcel of land in Northeast Portland just the other day that would be, and we build kind of at or below the median family income price range. It would have been perfectly situated fairly near a bus line, a great area for 10 missing middle units. We took one look at it and walked away from it because the transportation street improvement requirements that Portland would hit us on that property would be upwards of probably $200,000 or $250,000. And that property will sit there vacant and probably never develop because of the street and improvement standards that they've placed on that property. I know Habitat's dealt with that issue up here in Portland on a lot of projects that they've looked at. So we need to take another look at if there's some other way to address some of these public works standards and how we get through the processes on them.
All right, thank you, Justin. And no right level at which to comment here. Too big picture or too detailed. We need to kind of get everything on the table and address as many of these things as we can. So really whatever has come across, you've come across in your areas of expertise is very much welcome. All right, Robert Justice, go right ahead.
Hello, everybody. Building off of that comment, I feel like a lot of transportation jurisdictions, I often describe them as my nemesis. It is absolutely, it's a constant battle, but I want to elevate that to specifically with ODOT and the intersection between several of the state agencies, ODOT, DEQ, those departments that we end up dealing with, would love to see policy or even internal conversations within those departments about how they prioritize permitting, specifically when it's related to housing and even more so affordable housing. I'm involved with a project right now, and I think we're in our 14th month trying to get our ODOT permit. Little maddening. And when I was talking to the city manager, he just could not go on and express enough of his frustration. So, I think there are obviously a lot of these other departments, that, need to evaluate and look at how they can help on production. And that will include also not departments, but also the utilities and PGE specifically, and how they are a part of the solution of increasing production and making things move faster. I have a list of about 24 items here, so I'm going to pick and choose, but I'm just going to throw out something in my mind that's big that maybe, it's probably something you have to go to the voters, but is there a way to perhaps use the kicker as a source? And somebody told me that, they're looking at like $5 billion potentially with the state's kicker, but, if you could, when we, obviously one of the big question marks is money and how do we get more money in the system? Is there an opportunity, to reallocate dollars, that could go towards land, infrastructure? I mean, not towards bureaucracy as much, but more about tangible assets and things that we can build off of in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And you bring up a good point, right? With the way that our charge has been framed of increasing housing production year over year, it is a kind of ongoing charge. And conceptually, if we're going to be doing that with utilizing public money, we need some sort of evergreen source of public money. I had the opportunity to ask Governor Kotek, hey, how do you want this group to engage with that issue? And, I think where the direction is we should very much feel free to, have a very clear-eyed identification of the economic impacts of the recommendations that we make. Say from a policy perspective, hey, this needs, sources of funding from the state, from local government, et cetera, but that we don't necessarily need to, as a group, identify where that money comes from, just because I think, at the highest level, the state's getting into a little bit of a different line of business than it's been before. And we know that there's not identified funds or unspoken for funds out there. So there's a whole other step following our recommendations, but that we should take that funding question head on as goes with our recommendations. We just don't need to actually find where those funds come from, because I'm not sure that we could. All right, so keeping us going, Gary Rabaija.
Thank you. Fellow Councilor Daniel Bunn mentioned the things being at odds, and one of those I feel like is that comes a lot is the bully wage triggers and how that adds cost. And of course, we want the right labor compensation and everything, but does create a bit of a hiccup for affordable housing when it comes to cost containment and all of that. Creates a gap that can't be addressed in any way and limits the density to 4 stories, right? And so there's a lot of things that is why we see only 4-story affordable housing, when it could really be maximizing the density there. Another, like the local zoning code that may require commercial frontages as part of the development requirement, then also triggers the bully wages. So how do you address these paradoxical pieces? And then similarly, I think I believe it was Justin Wood who mentioned the permitting process. Before the permitting process, there's also hiccups and hurdles in the entitlement process with the in certain jurisdiction, really heavy design review process and design requirement, which inherently tends to cause inefficiency and add cost to the design. And when we're trying to be innovative and simple, right, sometimes that's a problem. And I know during Boli's presentation, or not, I meant OCS's presentation on NOVA, you talked about looking at other processes, but the competitive process sometimes really makes me think about this paradox again. We are at a shortage. There's a huge demand for housing, and yet why is there competition to make this happen? And for a lot of the nonprofit and BIPOC developers who spend a lot of time in the pre-development, when they don't win the funding, all of that is wasted resources, and that happens a lot every year. How can we change that? How can we change the process of allocation of the funds so no one's competing? No two really good nonprofits, BIPOC developers are competing for the same fund around the same area, right? How can we address that? Another thing was I saw that in the OHCS also promoting BIPOC developers, but I think there's also this challenge with the perception from certain jurisdiction not believing and trusting that these BIPOC developers or nonprofit developers do have the capacity to do the development, and that they can be on par with for-profit developments, because I've been on the losing side with the nonprofit developers who have been, not chosen in favor of someone who they feel like have the development chops. So if we are to develop, these nonprofit developers, give them the opportunity. How can we do that? How can we improve that, right? So I'll stop that. I've said quite a few there. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Gary, and I hear you loud and clear on that. If a big portion of the scoring system for any proposal is a track record of producing, take a look at all the different hurdles to having a BIPOC development company that come along with the economic impacts that Alan talked about earlier, right? Like there wasn't an opportunity for decades and decades to have that track record. So how do you score as high, et cetera? So I really appreciate you pointing that out. Natalie Janney, please, if you would.
Thank you. There's been so many good things suggested so far, and it's hard to come up to limit it to just 1 or 2, but I'll do my best. I look forward to the survey, so I'm stretching my fingers already. I think one of the things, and I mentioned this last time, is I would really love just all the parts that we really look at time, because while it'd be great to develop workforce and get more inspectors and get more plan reviewers and to get more land in the urban growth boundaries, right now we can't get things through. And so that is land use and permitting. I know Justin kind of touched on the public works process, but there are some jurisdictions we work with where it is common, all of our firms in the area have an average of 6 to 9 reviews for construction plans. And at the end, you're doing things that are so silly to change the plans. They don't actually change the design. I mean, we had one engineer in town had to change his plans, raise a pipe invert by a 1/16 of an inch, which can't even be constructed, that difference. And that takes time. And we just really need to figure out ways to simplify the process, incentivize jurisdictions to work with the developers. Right now, it feels like a lot of us versus them type, conflict between the two groups. So if we could figure out a way to incentivize communities to work with developments to help get plans approved, I think that would be good. But that's one of the biggest hurdles, is just the amount of time that it takes to get things through Public Works. And then another thing I wanted to mention was just the effects of NIMBYism on development. We have had, I could give so many examples where having a neighbor who didn't want something in the vacant field next to them reduced the density of a project, or just dragged it out and did appeals, because they can do appeals without having to raise any type of a jurisdictional issue, and they don't have to pay for the appeal because they did it through the neighborhood association. And it added 3 months onto the project, which came at during the time when construction costs were going up significantly. And we did a back of the envelope calculation that it raised the cost of that project by $750,000 in 3 months. And that was about $100 a door for that apartment complex. So just the effect that NIMBYism can have both on time, cost, and density. So those were the two I wanted to mention.
Thank you, Natalie. I appreciate it. Eric Olson.
Yeah, a lot of the things that have been brought up are on my list, and look forward to the survey. So I think kind of in preparation for this, I sort of reached out to some of the jurisdictions that I work with, and to try to kind of figure out, moving forward, how would we, be able to work, to Natalie's point, work together to be able to sort of accomplish this. And some of the big concerns, I think, are partially the sort of the state of existing infrastructure of cities and the costs and what needs to be done to be able to accommodate the kind of growth that we're talking about. I think that, and that really goes back to a mechanism of funding for both that and for additional staffing to be able to process the sort of the increase in quantity as we go down the road. Because I think, if we don't have, if the cities are not equipped to handle the existing, to Natalie's point, the existing workload, if there is a significant increase, it will be nothing but a nightmare to try to increase the level of permitting. One thing I think in terms of kind of the UGB, the existing way in which we inventory buildable lands, I think it's the way I understand it, and having talked to building officials or planners, I think if we if a piece of property, let's say hypothetically, I'm a small developer, let's say you have a 3-acre piece of land, and then you have maybe a half an acre of wetlands in the middle, or in a spot that makes it very difficult to develop. That land is still considered, buildable, and in effect, it's not technically buildable. And I think the way in which, so I think just some mechanism to begin to kind of rethink how we define buildable land, I think is a really important thing. And then to Margaret's point about innovation, I think we are in an industry, the building industry, which is incredibly lacking in innovation. And I do think that it's really important that we, as we move forward, we begin to look at different ways to sort of improve on what we do. And I think one way to do it, one really smart way to do it, is to have pilot projects, beta test projects, take them out, see if they work, and work, in conjunction with the state to begin to test things. Maybe 50% of the ideas don't work, but it's really important, I think, that we pilot projects to be able to improve on what we do, because the housing industry is really has remained relatively unchanged for 50 years, and I think that's a deep sort of systemic problem that I think as a state we can do something to sort of correct.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate those comments. That note on innovation. We brought up a few times the kind of offsite manufacturing of kind of modular, but there's also a number of new technologies in building components and materials, folks trying to decarbonize, all the things that are the component parts of the built environment, and how does that ever, come to the forefront and have the best ideas rise to the top and sync those up with the state permitting standards and, the necessary insurance to go ahead and do all those type of things. So a pilot and beta test project sounds great to kind of call those things to the forefront. Ernesto Fonseca, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Hall and members of the committee, council. Oh my God, I have a lot of comments to make here, but I'm going to try to keep it short. Number one is I do think that in order for us to really take this work very seriously, we need to define the crisis of housing as an actual crisis. We continue to talk about code, we continue to talk about zoning, we continue to talk about process, all the way across as if nothing was happening. Again, I'm going to offer the example of the vaccine, COVID vaccine. We skipped years and years of vaccine development in the name of saving people and putting, that vaccine to the front. Did they make some mistakes? Yes, but for the most part, no. When it comes to permitting, which is definitely a pain to go through that process in Portland, but in other cities is not as much, yet continues to be a process that we could forego for a little while. Doesn't matter if the city gives us a permit or not, we are still liable for it. If something happens to the building, to the people there, we're still liable, our engineers, our architects, ourselves. So that permit comes from the city. Sure, they are providing a second set of eyes for us to do safe work, but we are still paying for whatever happens in that building. So in my view, if we make a statement that this housing crisis is truly a housing crisis, zoning and everything else, should go on a second priority altogether. I'm not, I don't know, when I see the Air Force, going to a different country and building an airport in, well, at least a runway and a tower in 3 days, for that to happen in Portland, it will be 3 years. And who is supervising that work? Do we think that these people want to land in that runway and die? No, we're willing to do good work as long as you guys let us to do the work and make this happen. Now, when it comes to, that's one comment, when it comes to developers of color, I do think that we need to invest in us, altogether. Everybody probably have already read the New York Times, in which 12,000, mainstream development companies in the country, out of all of them, only 1,000 are managed or owned by people of color. Out of those, 380 something are managing over $50 million in revenue per year, and only one of those 389 are a developer of color, and it's a Latino. There's not a Black woman, a Black man, just one. That's it. So investing in us as developers will be incredibly important, not just in the nonprofit side, which for us is already a lot of work, for us to get any projects. No, let alone if I were to be a private developer trying to get my name out there, I wouldn't have money for guarantees for construction. Getting lending, will be a nightmare. So I don't feel that we, even going through all of this process, that we're taking this seriously. People are dying on the streets. People continue to, live on tents that are extremely substandard. So I want to know what do we want to do with this, follow the process? Is that what we want to do, or build houses? And I know that planners and, building officials, within cities will disagree with most of what I said, but what I'm saying is in response to a crisis, not in response to code. If we want to go through code, time, everything that has been said, everything that we already know, we don't have to repeat that to ourselves, here over and over again. That takes 7 months, 6 departments in the city of Portland to go through a permit, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the projects that we have, 18 to 24 months to do any construction, waiting for inspections to come in and come out. I am still liable. I wish the city were liable if something happened to my building after getting that permit, but that is not the case. I am still liable. So I will continue to be liable if I build something that is substandard. I don't know. I have a bunch of recommendations that I can write down and send them over to you guys, in terms of how to make this happen soon. But I will stop there. It is, personally speaking, very frustrating for us to go through more process to refine the process. What is that? Just give me some money and I will go and build stuff.
Right on. Thank you, Ernesto. Well said. Good combination of the humanistic side and cutting the red tape and finding the middle there. Tom Cody, please.
I'm glad. Nice disruption, Ernesto. It's great to follow you. I do think the council, there's something to this thing with the standardization of plans and permits, maybe at the state level with BCD, and maybe they have certain programs for manufactured housing and modular housing, but maybe really making that a much more robust system and having basically pre-approved both engineering and building plans for higher density types of construction, medium density types of construction. I think 6 units are now allowed, up to 6 units on a standard 5,000 square foot single family detached lot. So to standardize plans like that and potentially look at a moratorium on fees would be a second thing. SDCs, a lot of capital is going to other places because it's become so expensive to develop here in Oregon. And in some of our local jurisdictions, permits and fees are $20,000 to $30,000 a unit, which is a margin on a typical development project. So we just built a large multifamily project in Spokane. Permits and fees are $500 a unit. So I think a moratorium for a period of time to incentivize a dramatic increase in production would result if we had a moratorium on fees like that. Thirdly, I think, and I'm just going to do 3 for now, but I'll send you guys something. I think some form of fund, like with rising interest rates, some form of very large loan fund, which would continually be replenished, that would provide capital for home construction, whether it's for sale or for rent, because construction is intrinsically risky and because it requires typically guarantees. If it doesn't have required guarantees, it's high interest rate. Something like that, some tool like that would invite a lot of people, large and small, across all geographies to begin participating in the solution. So I think we should consider a large funding mechanism like that in Oregon.
All right, thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. Erica Mills, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Co-Chair Hall. I noticed that Deborah Flagans had her hand up for a while, and so I'll defer to her first, if you don't mind.
Oh, all right. So Deborah, go ahead. I'm not.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Damian. Specifically, in order for us to hit the 36,000 a year, I think we're going to have to address our land supply issue. Currently, we have less than 1% of our available residential land is available in the state of Oregon that residential development can be built on. And I think that focusing on areas that are contiguous to our urban growth boundary and large areas that we can come into and build inclusive communities that reach different affordability levels and different types of housing is going to be an important way for us to be able to hit and our 36,000 a year. The second item is I think that we need to really take a hard look at our wetland requirements, especially in our upper Willamette Valley area and our coastal communities. They're significantly hit with reduced opportunities for housing because of these restrictions. And this is largely due to the limited land banks that are available, as well as the mitigations and the costs that go along with that. And I would like those two to be added to the list. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Deborah. And popping back over to Erica, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your patience with that. One thing I don't think I heard talked about today is the role of parking, especially in smaller cities, more rural cities, where parking may be a city regulation that causes the development to be overly expensive and not a viable project then because of the city parking regulations, when in fact parking is not actually a problem in that area, or the city could do other things that should really be under the city's obligation to handle the parking situation, rather than push that off onto developers, particularly affordable housing developers. And the other thing I want to add is I don't want to assume this as a given. I've heard so many wonderful things in this group, and I support pretty much everything that I've heard today, but I just want to call out the importance of sustainability and ensuring that we're setting our future generations up for success, and that we're not setting them up with something that will need to be disposed of at some expense and environmental cost in the future. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Mr. Hill, go right ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'll make it brief. I think we blew over the talent report way too fast. It was a 60-page report that I read twice. And, not only do we need the talent right now, bully was only mentioned in there 2 times, and that was enforcement. They've got to be an equal partner in this. And secondly, the talent, we've got to continue with the CTE education, or otherwise it's going to be poverty all the way up. We've got to keep educating these kids at the lower level. They're not all going to go to college. I've gone to so many meetings where I met with everybody there was with respect, Dr. Who, Dr. No, Dr. Love, and they give about 5% of the time towards CTE training, and then they move on, and it's because of their training. They're trained to be educators. And they come up with pathways that employers really don't care about, and it takes way too long to get there. And so we have to engage bully, and we have to open up some pathways. If you look at page 30 and 31 of that report, it shows about construction, the need for construction workers there, and we're ignoring it. And you're not going to build 80% more houses or homes or living dwellings without some more plumbers and electricians and HVAC people. And that's my high horse. I'll get off of it because I know we're out of time.
All right, thank you, Riley. Appreciate it. Let me just check in with the group. I'm not seeing any more hands that are up. I know there are some council members that haven't spoken yet. So anyone out there that wants to say a final thing? All right, so we're in good shape. I wanted to give a little bit more space, and yeah, we're behind the agenda, but for this council to kind of do a little bit of getting to know each other and hearing from each other directly. We have a time crunch at the front end of this process to get to the framework. However, we're going to be working together all year, and I think figuring out where folks are coming from and what priorities and what expertise everyone has is a big part of setting ourselves up for success in this process. So with that, I want to talk, and this is going to be kind of on the fly here with my co-chair and with Matt, about how we want to deal with the agenda and the prioritization process for issues and recommendations. Looking at the clock, it's 3:56. We're scheduled to stop at 4. I think our options are functionally, to do it next week or to stay a little bit after 4 p.m. Looking for input from JD and or Matthew on this.
Sure, I'll jump in. I'm going to assume of the 24 council members that are here, more than one can't really stay long because of other obligations without needing to do a poll, unless people, I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. So
I saw a head nod for next week and not a whole lot for stay after 4.
Staying later on a Friday when it's nice out. Yeah. So hold on, I'm going to share the screen just because I think folks, this will be helpful for some folks. So I think what we're going to do, this has been really helpful dialogue, and I definitely appreciate that the co-chairs wanted to give kind of some more time for dialogue on the back end of this meeting. So just to kind of remind us of where we are and where we need to get to, after this meeting, later tonight, we'll be sending out a survey. So it's a survey that was developed by our team of folks here with the agencies. It's going to ask you which of those existing recommendations that we had to kind of rush through at the beginning of the meeting that all the members want to focus on, and then to list new issues and barriers that the council members want to dive into. So that survey will come out. It'll have all the existing recommendations. You just click on the ones that you want to spend some more time on during the process. And then it's text fields that let you identify which new issues. And we've also been, recording this and documenting all the issues that folks have flagged. We were also, so Director Bateman and Natasha from OHCS, we're going to facilitate a conversation around what are the key levers to help prioritize this giant list that we're going to get. So how do we prioritize which ones to focus on? And then how do we group them in a way that is probably going to feed into work groups, right? Breaking the council up into work groups and then be able to identify which issues are the highest priority. So just given time, I think we will move the prioritization. So what you should expect at next Friday's meeting, please complete the survey by, we're hoping the end, essentially midnight next Monday to give us time to prep all the material. We can come back to you next Friday, if this works for the co-chairs. We can come back to you next Friday with all of those essentially issues that you've identified that, hey, we want to dive into these and develop recommendations on them. We will group them by some groupings that we think fit, and also present a conceptual way to prioritize them based on the goals of the EO. And we'll consult with the co-chairs and the governor early next week. And then the third meeting can really be spent, you will present it pretty briefly and you can digest it. And the bulk of the time will be spent then on making any changes that the council wants. So are there any issues missing? Do we want to take any issues off? Are the groupings correct? And how they're prioritized? Are we using the right, are we thinking about the right way to prioritize them, or do we want to change that? So it can be mostly a working meeting of the council to really focus in on, here are the issues, here's how we're going to group them, here's how we would prioritize them. And then that will allow us to do the staff work by the time the fourth meeting is here, to actually have a kind of at least the content, maybe not the nicely designed document, but the content version for your full framework. So that's what I would recommend. Happy to have anybody say that that's not okay, or co-chairs, your thoughts on that.
That works from my perspective. I'd point the committee members to some of the documents in the packet today, with the draft existing recommendations status assessment being at the high end of that. It's really, a line item with just the quick punchy version of all the state work that's been done. It also has an initial structure in the recommendation category of, trying to identify some categories there. So I imagine some of the structure that we talk about is going to flow from that. I think there's a bit of a preview of a whole lot of those issues there. But remember, we're in the phase where we want to get everything on the table. So please be responsive to this survey. Please come with however many recommendations, issues, barriers. I know keep putting those three words together. They're different but overlapping concepts. The idea is we want everything. Please engage with that survey that's coming your way. And unless, Matthew, there's anything else, anything for the good of the order from the council?
One thing I would recommend, or at least a question to the council, I think is being okay with the staff taking a first stab at grouping the materials. I think all the documentation, everything's going to be in there and listed out, but making some natural groupings around some key themes, I think is going to be important to help us keep moving forward. I think we could probably brush through that pretty quickly and make sure everything is where people think it should be. But I think it'll be really helpful to keep us moving forward if we can start grouping that into 4 or 5 or even 6. 6 is getting probably a little extensive of key themes that will probably end up being rolled over into our group sessions as we move into the summer. And I don't see anybody shaking their heads now, so I hope that's okay.
All right. Well, thank you, JD, and thank you everybody for your time this afternoon. Looking forward to our continued work. I'll see you right here next week. Take care, folks.
Bye, everybody.